Hey, how's it going? So there was a really interesting article in the UNS review about Thucydides' trap. Okay, I'll put a link in the description below to the article. But here's the issue. See, Thucydides' trap is the notion, really the observation, that when there is a dominant power and an ascendant power starts to rise and perhaps surpass the dominant power, there is inevitably conflict between the two. And this conflict, this war, can be catastrophic, and whoever wins this war winds up on top, and it's usually the ascendant power, because those things that gave it ascendancy to begin with are the things that aid it in its success in the conflict with the declining power. And so over the last several years, at least since 2017 or so, there's been this notion that the United States is falling into Thucydides' trap insofar as China is concerned. Because the United States has been the global hegemon since, certainly since 91, at least you could argue since 45. And now China is in the ascendancy. It has, in terms of purchasing power parity, its economy is far larger. And insofar as different metrics are concerned, it's more industrialized, it's more successful. It's the coming thing, okay? And so when that happens, historically, the observation has been that when the dominant power is surpassed, there is a conflict. And the last time that this happened in the West was when the Americans overtook the British, but there was no conflict. Because of, hang on, let me light my cigarette. Because what happened was that by the time the British in the late 19th century realized that the United States was surpassing them, the United States was already too powerful for the British to do anything about it. In point of fact, there were some British politicians who argued that what the British should have done in order to trip up the American ascendancy, would have been to side with the Confederates during the Civil War in the 1860s, or do something like that. But in the 1860s, the British didn't really have the conception that the United States would become the power that would overwhelm the British Empire, which of course happened. You could argue between the end of the 19th century and certainly by World War I. And so in that competition between the United States and the British Empire, there was an ascendant power, the United States, but the dominant but declining power, Great Britain, failed to react, and when it realized the situation, the United States was far beyond the British Empire's ability to do anything about it. Now, why am I bringing this up? Well, because in the UNS piece, there's a very interesting notion that makes a hell of a lot of sense. And let me recapitulate it. The notion is as follows, that the neocons have ensured that there will be no war between the declining power, the United States, and the ascendant power, China. And the argument is very interesting, and there's a great deal of logic to it, so let me recapitulate it fully. See, the idea that UNS has is that, you see, because the neocons were so aggressive towards Russia with the sanctions, with trying to isolate it and all the rest of it, Russia very quickly joined even closer to China and diplomatically made a lot of efforts around the world to bring other countries in line with its point of view. That is, be sympathetic to the Russian point of view. And in point of fact, at this time, most of the non-aligned nations around the world, in the Middle East, in Africa, South America, and Asia, they support the Russians. Many of these governments can't say so openly, but like in the case of India, they don't say so openly, but they are trading like there's no tomorrow with the Russians, don't look at what they say, look at what they do, right? And so a lot of other countries are in the same boat, that they might not be openly saying that they're supporting the Russians, but they're certainly acting as if they do in terms of trade, in terms of diplomatic efforts to come closer to Russia and China, The Eurasian alliance of Russia and China is agglomerating most of the rest of the world because of the hysterical overreaction of the neocons in the United States. Most countries around the world, as I've explained previously, are freaking out over the fact that the Americans sequestered, i.e. stole, the Russian foreign currency reserves, which is rumored to be about 300 billion. I don't think it's actually that much. I think it's actually a lot lower, but that's not important for this discussion. There's a perception that it was $300 billion that the Americans simply took and kept as their own, right? And other countries with big, positive balances of trade and foreign currency reserves, like Saudi Arabia, they're very nervous about that. They're very nervous about falling on the naughty list of the Americans and losing their money, that the Americans will take their money too. And so a lot of these countries are de-dollarizing, getting out of the treasuries very quickly. This de-dollarization, I've talked about it before, it's a big deal. It's going to change the whole geography of international finance, and it will certainly hurt the United States very badly. It already has. A lot of the inflation that the United States has been experiencing over the last 12 months is due in part to its sanctions against Russia, which drove up oil prices, and also the de-dollarization of a lot of countries outside the conflict area. Mm-hmm. And so the United States has gotten very weak, economically certainly, and in terms of prestige, because of the neocons' hysteria towards Russia and now towards China. And so the argument is that, see, since China has gotten so much closer with Russia, I mean, they are pretty much married at this point, and since the rest of the world is joining in, agglomerating with this Eurasian alliance, that China will have surpassed the United States so much, and the United States will have declined so much, that the Americans will calculate that it is not to their advantage to actually go to war with China. Now, this is a very elegant notion, and it makes a hell of a lot of sense, because most people who know anything about the American military will recognize that the United States, at this time, especially considering that China has Russia as its no-limit partner, its ally, the United States doesn't really have what it takes to fight the Chinese. It might have had the illusion that it did prior to the Russian war in Ukraine, but not anymore. The reality is staring them hard at the face, especially considering the Russians' use of hypersonic weapons, the notion that artillery is king, the realization, finally, among some military people in the United States that, Taiwan is right in front of China, whereas insofar as the United States, Taiwan is halfway around the world. So the notion of, quote-unquote, defending democracy in Taiwan, which is just a fig leaf of bullshit, well, that's not really a credible proposition for the United States Armed Forces. And so UNS has this really interesting notion that, perhaps this Thucydides trap that the United States finds itself in will not lead to war. Now, this is a comforting thought. Perhaps in my fear and worry about such a conflict, I'm grabbing at straws. I'd really be interested in what you guys have to say about this notion. It's not original to me. It's in this UNS review article, which I'm posting below. I really suggest you read it. It's really good. It's a little bit overlong because it gives a lot of the background to the notion of Thucydides' trap, but it's worth your while if you're really interested in the topic. And if you're not, just skip the first couple of parts of it. It's really the last third that he gets into the argument that I am recapping here in this video. But the notion that, the Chinese, with their alliance with Russia, and the fact that Russia has successfully, in terms of its diplomatic efforts, brought so many of the rest of the non-aligned nations around the world on their side, they've sort of like leapfrogged the Americans, avoiding a possible conflict. Let's hope that this is an accurate analysis of what might happen. As usual, understand what's going on.